Now I can't see you and I can't see chat, so I get a verbal that this is appearing to you correctly. That'd be great.
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. I'm Ian Whitney, use he and his pronouns, and I'm the manager of ASR Custom Solutions. I'm going to talk today about some work that the ASR Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee has been doing lately and how that impacted on my team's recent round of hiring. Welcome to the team, Noelle Noterman, who joined us last month. If you want to get to the slides or other stuff, that's the link. I've got the script there, PDFs of the slides, and I think that's about it. So I'm going to be talking today about the ASR Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Hiring Principles. And this is a set of principles that the DEI committee formalized a couple months ago. I'm a member of that committee, and I joined back in February. And we had a goal to set these principles to help improve the hiring processes in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion within ASR. And principles are a little different than practices. Practices are concrete things to do or tools to use. And we have in the past delivered a set of practices and a kind of a toolkit to hiring managers for them to follow. But your practices can go out of date. I also think practices as a concrete thing can be easier for people to say no to. Well, I don't want to use tool X because it doesn't work for my particular hiring process. And they can be great, but the nice thing about principles is that they can guide people to find their own solutions that work for their team, but that still meet the overarching principles of the department. And we can get directives from our guidance from our directors to say across the entire department, these are the principles that you should be following when hiring. Before I dive too much into those, I want to give some thanks to folks. Members, past and present of the ASR DEI committee. Like I said, I only joined the committee in February, and this work had already started and was well along. And I want to particularly thank Christina Jung, who was a member of the committee. I had left by the time I joined, but then came back to help to kind of fine tune things, and she created the CARE acronym that I'm going to be talking about today. I helped work on these principles, but what I'm going to be talking about more today is less about that work and more on how the principles came into play when we were hiring, replacing Remy Abdullahi, who left earlier this year. These principles are focused on hiring, not retention, and obviously improving your hiring process, but having terrible retention doesn't get you anything. The DEI committee wants to look at retention next, but I'm not going to be talking about that today, but it is super valuable work. All right, so the principles. Kind of the log line of the principles, the top level is hiring diverse teams takes time and intentionality. And then we broke these principles up into 4 sections: commitment, accountability, representation, and empathy. And you can see there that that spells care. We're going to dig deeper into kind of each chunk of this slide. To start off with, this is, like I said, the log line of the whole thing. Hiring diverse teams take time and intentionality. And everything we're going to talk about is really just almost a restatement of this one sentence. So if you want to take anything away from this talk, and if you want to just take off your reading glasses so that people can't see what you're doing and go read something else for the next 20 minutes, remember this and you'll be good. You have to want to do the work, and then you have to do the work. I will say I had a coarser version of the sentence that I pitched to the committee. Unsurprisingly, they didn't take it. From that kind of log line, we have the 4 sections: commitment, accountability, representation, and empathy. Within commitment, we have these 2 principles: recognize the importance of diversity hiring, and then dedicate time to include DEI hiring principles and practices in your process. The first one doesn't take a lot of examples of how my team recognized the importance of diversity hiring. I'm just going to say it's important. While I've been with the ASR Custom Solutions team, we've worked pretty continuously on our hiring process to make it more open and equitable. And we've seen results in the people that we get to interview and the people we get to hire. And as a result, that kind of growing diverse collection of skills, backgrounds, and identities on our team are a really big reason for our success and satisfaction with the work that we do. So, for that first step here, recognizing the importance of diversity hiring, we're there. We're very pro. The second one is dedicating time. And what I would say here has worked for us is to make hiring the team's job. When I first became a manager of the team, I figured, well, what do managers do? They hire people. So hiring process is entirely my gig, right? And that did not lead to good results because as a manager of the university, you basically have like 8 jobs, and I don't have the time to dedicate to the hiring process, not as much time as I want. So we moved pretty quickly to having team members take the lead on different parts of our hiring process. There are 3 steps in our hiring process, so we have 3 leads. And that allowed each lead to focus on just their part of the hiring process. And I really made it clear to those folks that hiring is going to be their job for the duration of the hiring process. And that is going to lead to less time developing and less features delivered to our stakeholders, which it's then my job to communicate that back out to managers and those stakeholders. The other part of this, it is the team's job, both not just during the hiring process, but both before and after. Before the hiring process, we spend time researching the groups that we want to do outreach to in terms of letting them know about the upcoming job posting. Building the relationships that lets us do that outreach. Reviewing and rewriting both the interview process itself and the rubrics that we use to score people as they go through the interview process. And it also goes well after the person's hired or has even joined the team. We have a retrospective, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. And those retrospectives lead to action items that we need to do right away. My team only hires, it's on average once every 3 years or so. It's not a ton. And if we set aside those action items and we say, oh, we'll get to those when we hire again, we're not going to remember what those are. So, if you took at the hiring process as a whole, from the time of, hey, we're going to have to hire someone to, everyone's kind of done with the hiring process, I would say it's about a 3 to 4 month deal. And during that time, the team is as a whole involved in it, and they're dedicating that time to the hiring process. Our most recent hiring process actually took a little longer than that because of the first kind of summer where people got to take vacations in a while, and that slowed things down. But we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of that in a second. All right, so the second group here is accountability, the A in CARE. Acknowledge biases and implement plans to mitigate them. Provide transparency to candidates about the position, process, and communication, and then reflect on the hiring process and utilize measurable goals for improvements. So on that first step, acknowledging biases, I would say there's kind of like 2 chunks here for our process and things that I've noticed in terms of our biases. On the first one is reduce requirements to a bare minimum. And I'm going to say we're starting here. When I joined the team was not diverse. It was much smaller. And it was at the time of people who are actively working, all folks that looked like me, right? And that hiring process that brought me in had a ton of gatekeeping that was really going to prevent the team from changing. Requiring a bachelor's, I think there was a preferred requirement for a master's degree. There's a homework step that involved incredibly opaque code. And the homework step was also actually impossible to solve, just for fun. And really high and uncommon technical requirements. If you put on your job description that you're only going to hire people who know Ruby, then you have a very small market of folks to hire from. And there are a mountain of biases like those that I mentioned, and a bunch of other implicit biases that really push us to hire the same kind of person over and over again. So we've been trying to recognize and mitigate those biases. And the first one there is just reducing those requirements in the job description to a bare minimum. Gone are the preferred master's degree. Gone is anything about knowing Ruby, because no one does. We were able to get rid of the language around a bachelor's and replace it with language that is not as loose as I would like, but better in terms of what HR will allow us to do. We can accept people without a bachelor's now, and we have hired that way before, which I like a lot. And we just keep cutting them down. I describe requirements in a job description as kind of like barnacles. They just kind of grow there over time, and you really just have to go in every so often and just scrape them all off. Another bias is, on that homework assignment that I mentioned before, We don't use homework assignments that bias towards candidates that don't have kids or obligations, right? Like we're not going to send something off that says, hey, read this code for the whole weekend and then let us know what you think. I think in our latest job interview, the homework assignment, which was not, I'll talk a little bit more, but not really a homework assignment, we gave them access to the repo for a fairly short period of time, and also made it really clear to them that this wasn't a puzzle that they had to solve. We just kind of wanted them to have familiarity and questions when they came into the interview process. And we focus our job postings on higher level values and less on specific technical requirements. We want to focus on things that we can't teach, right? So our job posting might say a lot about being interested or experienced in web application development. You know, if you're not interested in web application development, you're probably not going to have a great time on my team because that's all we do. But do you need to know Ruby or Rails? No, that's trainable. Over on the other column, there are some stuff that are biases that I recognize, but that I have found harder to just mitigate away, right? So these are more things where I feel like we have to just be acknowledging of these biases and notice when they come up and say, okay, I'm having this bias and I'm going to acknowledge it and not really pay attention to it, just let it go. And one, and this is particularly for me, is resume formatting. Like if you spend 20 minutes in Adobe Illustrator on your resume, I'm gonna love it, right? And if you, it's a very visual thing, and I recognize this bias in myself. And you know, there's probably a way to mitigate this. You have someone take all the resumes and type them all into a Google Doc so they all have the same formatting. But we haven't done that. I think it's just a bias to be aware of. Cover letters, you know, I will say we actually have taken some steps here. For a long time, we had a line in our job posting that was, we place a lot of value on a cover letter. And we had a recent conversation with Prince Saw, who's in OIT's HR department. And he pointed out that this is really a cultural bias, that there's a lot of folks and cultures and countries that just don't do cover letters. And so if you say, well, this is what we're going to judge you on, you're introducing a bias there. And it's also, you know, our job is not writing cover letters all day long. So judging people on their cover letter on whether or not we're going to interview them doesn't make a ton of sense. So we got rid of that line in our most recent job posting. And, you know, people still send in cover letters and we read them, but we just didn't take them into account in hiring. And the last one here in terms of harder stuff, I think is just names, right? You know, if you think of, you know, you can make this joke about kids who grew up in the 80s, but I think it's kids who grew up at any time. Think of the jokes that you've heard, you know, mainstream TVs or movies about stereotypical African-American names, Asian names, names of anyone who's not, you know, white Protestant. And all those jokes kind of build up a bias in your brain. And think of the reaction that you have to resumes with names that come in that are not culturally familiar to you. And I know it happens all the time. So one way that's been suggested of getting around this bias, of mitigating it away, is to anonymize resumes. And that definitely can take care of the name thing. I think it's important to be aware here that the names are kind of just the tip of the iceberg of a lot of different class and cultural signifiers that can appear on a resume. The formatting of the resume, colleges attended, fraternities or sororities that someone was in, where they live, student groups they might have been involved in. There's a lot of stuff that you can't really anonymize out of a resume. So our approach here has not been to anonymize resumes, but has been to just try to be aware of these biases and mitigate them mentally when they come up. Transparency is the next part of the accountability section here. And this is an example of our most recent job posting that we put onto our own team website. It's different than what goes up on the Use Jobs website. And we can get to a lot more detail here and a lot more text and links about exactly what the job's going to be, the salary, the team's values, exactly how to apply, and our exact hiring process. I don't have all that here, but if you want to see it, there's a link there at the bottom that you can go to that'll show you the markdown version of this. So we try to, in our job posting, be as transparent as possible about both the job itself, what will be involved, and the whole hiring process, so that people don't feel like they're kind of throwing their name into a mystery box. They don't know what's going to come out. Once those folks do apply, we really try to focus on honest, transparent communication about the whole hiring process. And that's, when a round is going to start, why there was a delay, and there were delays last summer because of vacations, what the interview is going to consist of, what success is in that interview, like what we want that person to kind of do to show their best selves, and kind of their status in the hiring process. And this is something that we've kind of been growing over time. And we actually got several compliments on our hiring process of the transparency this round. So both from folks who were applying and for folks that were involved in the hiring process itself. So I feel like that went pretty well for us. It's a lot of work. That just a ton of communication is, and honest communication is really hard, but we found it to be very worthwhile. And also an accountability is retrospectives and metrics. Reflect on what you did and see if what you did actually helped. And I mentioned some of this before. We have a retrospective at the end of hiring, what went well, what didn't go well. And we then use those to drive changes for the hiring documents for the next time we hire. Something that we're just starting to do here that I'm still not quite sure how it's going to work is you can go to HR after hiring and say, hey, can you give me diversity kind of breakdown of the people who applied? And they can send that to you, and also along with some extra details, and say, we think based upon the market, the metrics of people who applied to this job should look like this. Yours look like this. You had whatever, more of this category identity and less of this. Because we hire so infrequently, I don't know how useful this is going to be long term, right? We're taking snapshots 3 to 4 years apart. I don't know, but we're experimenting with that as a way of checking to see if we're actually making a positive difference here. And then review any new things that you might have tried and evidence of them working or not. An example here is a tool that we use for the first time in our phone screen process called Spark Hire. And Spark Hire is an asynchronous kind of video recording thing that you can use for phone screens, and HR runs it. And we use that to bring almost everyone who applied in for a phone screen, which is more than we normally do. And we use Spark Hire because it let us do a lot more phone screens. We wanted to really broaden the amount of people that we talked to. And so I think we had 23 people maybe get sent Spark Hire invites as part of this round of hiring. And there were a lot of benefits to it, right? A clear benefit is we phone screened a ton more people. We got to see a lot more people. And as a result, I think we brought more people in to that first round of interviewing, the actual kind of code side and the panel side of interviewing. But there's some evidence of it not working. Of the 23 people we sent out, I think 7 just kind of ghosted us. And is that due to them having other job interviews they're more excited about? Is it due to Spark Hire not being a good tool? We don't know. And ASR has used Spark Hire across several different hiring rounds now. And some folks have had a really great time with it, and some folks have found it to be really terrible. So that's an example of something where we're trying this out and still trying to get a sense of, is this working or not? Is this giving us what we want? Grab some water here. The R in CARE is representation. Focus on inclusion over exclusion. Form hiring committees with staff from various backgrounds. Recruit and select from a diverse candidate pool. Focus on inclusion over exclusion is a huge one for my team. And that top line there is, I think, our guiding light for every decision we make in the hiring process, which is to give every candidate every opportunity to succeed. Because current IT practices are really focused on exclusion and weird puzzles and gatekeeping and arcane whiteboarding. And it's just a terrible process for the most part. It really boils down to kind of a Hunger Games of IT hiring. And if you're the last one standing, then congratulations, you get a job. And I don't know. I just don't want to deal with that. I don't want to put people through that. So we want candidates to feel successful through our process. So we'll do things like in that coding interview that I mentioned before, the homework one, we state multiple times that the goal of this interview is not working code or to get tests to pass or to do it in some amount of time. The goal is that we are sitting down as a team and discuss some code that we're not familiar with and talk about areas that we're not sure what it does, and also talk about how we might make a change to improve it. Whether or not we are successful in that, that's not the goal of the interview, right? So giving folks the opportunity to understand what it is to succeed in that interview. Something we might do going forward that we talked about in our last retrospective is to give panel candidates the questions in advance. We not sure how far in advance. It both solves a technical problem of remote meetings, but also, like, you know, knowing this question is coming up, how is that? It's not going to give you some sort of, like, you're not going to be able to game the interview based upon some question, knowing what the question is in advance. So we just keep trying to step farther along this path of making the candidate successful. We try to offer as much info as we can up front. And we saw that in the job posting. Here's the salary. Here's what you're going to do. Here's the exact interview process. And clear goals. I talked about that a little bit with, like, the goals of the coding interview. Now, on the second one of having diverse hiring committees, I think there's kind of two chunks to it here. And the first one here is, I think, is important, is reflecting the full team. You know, my team is small enough that we are all involved in the hiring process at some level. But as a team, we also work with other groups, right? We have stakeholders that help manage this tool, or we have BAs that help us figure out how to do this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And so we want to pull some representatives from those groups into the hiring process, because those are going to be the kind of folks that this person works with once we hire them. So when you're building out your hiring committee, I think it's important to reflect the full team that the person's going to be working with. And the second one here that I think is the most important here is that you want to honestly reflect your team's diversity. I think there's a ton of value in having committees that show the diversity that your department currently has, right? And if you're focusing on kind of a diverse hiring process, then you're going to want to say, like, oh, we want to show that diversity. But if you're working with a team that has a low kind of diversity, or someone, you've got maybe one person with this kind of background, then you're going to be asking those kind of really few diverse members of your team to be on every hiring committee and doing a ton of work. And I think that's really exhausting and tokenizing, right? So you can't push people into roles to make your team look more diverse than it actually is. And I think the thing to do here is, you know, go to folks that are a part of your team and ask them if they want to be involved in the hiring. Ask them how they want to be involved in the hiring. And if they say no, then okay, they said no. Like, I think it's just really important here if you set this goal of having diverse hiring committees, then that seems like a metric to game. And you're going to do what you can to have the most diverse hiring committee of all time. And that might not actually reflect the environment that that person is going to work in once they join the team. And so I think this one's an important kind of caveat about that principle of having diverse hiring committees. In representation, we wanted to have diverse recruiting. And in our kind of recruiting process, I don't know what HR does for recruiting. I've actually never asked them. So I don't quite know how their side of things works. But for us, we're out recruiting through personal networks, professional networks, and we're starting to look at paid networks. And the first two take a bunch of work to cultivate. And I mentioned that earlier in terms of dedicating time. Personal networks, I think it's important to remember that your personal network probably reflects you as a person. It's personal. So you might end up reaching out through that personal network and getting a lot of people who look a lot like you. You can build a personal network that is much more diverse and inclusive. That just takes work, and it's work that's totally worth it. Just recognize that that'll take time. Professional networks, and here I mean things like groups in the Twin Cities or around the state who have an interest in programming or whatever your industry is, that reflect different kind of backgrounds. Pi Girls is an example. There's a Python group of all women identity folks. They were in Minneapolis, I think. And they would send out notes for us about jobs we're hiring for, even though we don't use Python, but there's still a lot of overlap in that community. And those kind of professional networks, they'll respond differently to just some rando who sends them a job posting versus someone who's been involved in that committee for a long time, their community for a long time. So recognize here that that professional network and using them for recruitment is something you have to build up, right? And then paid networks are something we kind of just started learning about. I think we're late to the gate on this one. in the most recent round of hiring, Brittany Grainer, who's on vacation right now, did an amazing job in terms of diving into outreach and finding a ton of people for us to talk to. And we found that there are some groups that are like programmers of certain identities who say, yes, you can post job things through us, but it costs some amount of money, $200, right? And at that point for us, it was really late in the game to get the approval for that. So we didn't take that route this time, but I think it's a great idea, right? These folks are doing a ton of work to build these communities, and paying them to have access to that community and send them a job posting totally makes sense to me. And I think we'll do that in the future. And the last part of the CARE acronym is empathy. Give the candidate every opportunity to succeed. We've seen that one before. Remove barriers to the hiring process and provide a welcoming environment for all candidates. I've mentioned this before. This is just include, don't exclude. If you're giving the candidate every opportunity to succeed. People like succeeding, they don't like failing. Why put them through a process that they hate? With people on my team, I want them to be successful. And that really starts before they even join the team. Removing barriers, I think the number one barrier to remove here, we talked about some other ones in terms of job requirements, but help people apply. On our website, we have a step-by-step guide to using the HR job site. I don't know if the HR job site is better or worse or the same as all the other job sites out there, because I haven't applied for a job in forever. But it's not great, like it's pretty terrible. And so the more clear guidance you can give people to how to navigate the HR job site, the more people you're going to have in your applicant pool, and that's great. And the last one there on the empathy is just providing a welcoming environment. And this is going to depend on how you're hiring. Before we mostly hired in person, and I would say the U is a rat's warren of impossible navigation. So make wherever you're doing your interviews very easy to find. Help them with transportation. You can get parking vouchers. You can pay for rides. You can do all sorts of stuff here to help with the transportation side of things. Do other things like, standard hosting niceties, reducing scents, having nice lights, et cetera, et cetera. If you're remote, then it's a kind of a different situation. And I would say something that we didn't do this time that I would like to be more clear about next time is make it really clear that the camera is optional. If you're going to be on a Zoom call and you don't want to use your camera for whatever reason, okay, great. I don't have my camera on right now. I don't have my camera on at some of my team meetings. We don't have to have the camera on in job interviews. When you're introducing yourself to the applicant, use your pronouns just so that they're clear that this is the kind of environment that they're going to be working in. This is a personal bias of mine, but keep your background simple, right? I don't need to join a Zoom call with my carpet from the Shining Hotel background. I also don't really care for blurry backgrounds. I find them distracting. So I just usually turn them off. I think you can come to your own conclusions there on how you want to tackle that, but that's just a personal bias of mine. So anyways, we've kind of hopped through the 4 parts of the CARE acronym. And I just want to close with this. Again, this is the log line. This is what you need to know. You want to do the work, and then you have to spend the time to do the work. And it's slow, as anything involving kind of people is, and it's worth it. And if you have questions on processes or practices or anything else, you can ping me or my team or talk to us in Slack. If we do have time for questions, we can do some now. Again, there's the link to the slides, and that's it for me.